From the archives of the Midnight Society, we present a new account. This one comes to us not as a story told, but as a confession found. It was discovered in a salt-bleached journal, tucked inside a waterproof canister that washed ashore on the coast of Maine last winter. The journal belonged to the acting lighthouse keeper of St. Jude's Needle, a man who took the post to escape the world, only to find something waiting for him at its edge. The final entries are frantic, disjointed, and terrifying. We have done our best to reconstruct the timeline of events. The following is our interpretation of the last days of Thomas Vance, a man who learned that the sea doesn't just claim bodies, it claims souls. This is the story of the salt-stained man. They say you can't run from your ghosts. I thought that was a metaphor. I thought if I ran far enough, to the most isolated place on earth, I could prove them wrong. This is St. Jude's Needle, a fleck of granite, 100 miles from anything that breathes of humanity. The supply boat that dropped me here was my last link, and as it shrank on the horizon, I felt a kind of peace I hadn't known in years. The peace of a tomb. My contract is for 1 year, 365 days of solitude, with no company but the gulls and the roar of the Atlantic. My only duty is to tend the light, a massive, intricate lens of brass and glass, a machine with a heart that must never stop beating. The previous keeper, a man I only knew from a faded photograph in the registry, was named Silas. He'd been here for 30 years before the sea claimed him. Fell from the rocks during a squall, they said. A simple, tragic accident. His body was never found. I unpacked my few belongings into the small circular room at the base of the tower. The air was thick with the smell of salt, oil, and something else, something old and lonely. It felt like I was stepping into another man's life, another man's solitude. I was ready for it. I craved the silence. I craved the emptiness. I believed that out here, with nothing but the endless water to scream at, I could finally drown the memories that followed me. I was wrong. I wasn't running to an empty place. I was running to a place that was already occupied. My days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the tide. At dawn, I'd extinguish the light, draw the heavy curtains to protect the lens from the sun, and begin my chores, polishing the brass until it shone like gold, cleaning the glass until it was invisible, winding the great clockwork mechanism that turned the lamp. It was honest, physical work. It left my hands raw and my body tired, and for a few blessed hours each day, it left no room in my head for anything else. The logbook was my only reading material. The entries were sparse, written in a cramped, spidery hand. Wind from the northeast, sea running high, fuel reserves at 50%, repaired the winding gear. These were the chronicles of Silas. 30 years of a life reduced to barometric pressure and maintenance reports. There was nothing personal, nothing to reveal the man himself. But sometimes, as I ran my fingers over the brittle, yellowed pages, I felt a strange connection to him. We were two ghosts in the same machine, separated by half a century. We had both polished this same brass, stared out at this same unforgiving sea. I wondered if he too had come here to escape something. I wondered if the solitude had healed him, or if it had simply ground him down, worn him away like the waves on the shore, until there was nothing left for the sea to take but an empty shell. I told myself his story was not my story. His fate would not be my fate. This place was my sanctuary, not my prison. The loneliness was a physical presence. It was in the cry of the gulls, a sound that wasn't melancholy until you were the only one to hear it. It was in the wind that moaned around the tower, a constant, low complaint. At first, it was what I wanted. I would stand on the gallery for hours, letting the wind scour me clean. I would shout her name into the gale, the name I hadn't dared to speak aloud for over a year. The wind would snatch the syllables from my lips and tear them to shreds, and for a moment, the pressure in my chest would ease. But the ocean is a mirror. It reflects whatever you bring to it, and I had brought nothing but grief. The endless gray water began to look like my own sorrow, vast and inescapable. The isolation stopped being a comfort and started to feel like a cage. I began to talk to myself, just to hear a human voice. I'd narrate my chores, comment on the weather. I even started talking to Silas, asking his ghost if I was doing things right, if he approved of how I kept his light. It was a game, a way to fend off the madness that nibbles at the edges of a solitary life. But games have a way of becoming real out here. The island listens, and eventually, it answers. It was during a low tide, on my daily patrol of the island's perimeter, that I found it. My walk was a ritual, a way to feel the solid ground beneath my feet after a night spent in the swaying tower. I knew every rock, every tide pool, every jagged edge of St. Jude's needle. So when I saw the glint of green glass nestled amongst the black kelp-strewn rocks, it was an immediate anomaly, an intruder. My first thought was that it was just trash, a thoughtless offering from a passing ship. But it was old. The glass was thick and warped, the color of a deep sea, and its surface was covered in the telltale white calcification of years spent adrift. The cork was jammed deep in the neck, sealed with a black tar-like substance, and inside there was a small, tightly rolled scroll of paper. My heart gave a strange, hopeful lurch, a message, a connection to the world I had abandoned, a random, impossible chance that someone, somewhere, had cast their thoughts to the waves and they had found me. I carried it back to the lighthouse, my hands trembling slightly. It felt heavy, not just with its own weight, but with the weight of expectation. I set it on the small wooden table in my quarters and stared at it for a long time, the last rays of sunlight glinting off its salt-stained surface. I was almost afraid to open it, afraid of what it might say, but more afraid that it might say nothing at all. With a rusted corkscrew from the galley, I worked the cork free. It came out with a dry, dusty pop. I tipped the bottle, and the small scroll slid into my palm. It was damp, and it smelled of brine and decay. I unrolled it carefully, my fingers clumsy with anticipation. The paper was thick, almost like parchment, and incredibly fragile. The ink was faded, a pale sepia against the yellowed page, and the handwriting was a mess of spidery, near-illegible loops. It took me a moment to decipher the words. It wasn't a cry for help. It wasn't a love letter or a poem. It was 5 simple words, 5 words that made no sense. The new wick burns too bright. I read it again and again. A cold wave of disappointment washed over me. It was a prank, a joke from some sailor perhaps, who knew the lighthouse was here. Or maybe it was just nonsense, the ramblings of a drunk. A new wick. I had replaced the main wick in the lamp just last week, following the instructions in the keeper's manual. It was burning brighter than the old one, but how could anyone know that? There were no ships on the horizon. No one had been here for weeks. I crumpled the note in my fist, my brief flicker of hope turning to irritation. Just a stupid, meaningless coincidence. I tossed the paper into the small stove, watched it curl and blacken, and tried to put it out of my mind. But as I climbed the winding stairs to light the lamp that evening, I couldn't shake a new unsettling feeling. The feeling of being watched. For a week, nothing. The rhythm of my life returned, and I almost convinced myself the first bottle had been a dream, a figment of a lonely mind. I polished the brass, wound the clockwork, and spoke only to the gulls. Then, exactly 7 days after the first, I found the second bottle. It was in the same cove, resting in the same configuration of rocks, as if placed there by a careful hand. This one was different, a stout brown bottle that might have once held rum. The seal was the same black tar. My hands didn't tremble this time. A cold dread had replaced the hopeful anticipation. This wasn't a random occurrence. It was a message meant for me. Back in the lamp room, I opened it. The paper was the same, the handwriting just as faded. The message was longer this time, more specific. You are using too much oil. The light is a greedy thing. She does not like the waste. My blood ran cold. The fuel consumption rate had been my private obsession for the past week. The gauge showed I was burning through the paraffin oil faster than the manual suggested I should be. It was a problem I had mulled over in silence, a calculation I had checked and rechecked in the pages of my private journal. No one could know. It was impossible. This wasn't a prank from a distant sailor. This was intimate. The author of these notes knew my actions, my worries. They knew the inner workings of this tower. I looked out the lantern room window, scanning the horizon, the empty sea, the jagged rocks below. There was nowhere to hide on this island. I was alone. I had to be. But the note in my hand was a testament to the contrary. Someone was watching me, or something. The prank theory was dead. The only other explanation was Silas. Could he have survived? Could he be living here, a castaway on his own island, watching me from some hidden cave? The thought was absurd, but less absurd than a ghost writing me letters. I had to know more about him, more than the official logbook offered. I began to search the lighthouse top to bottom for anything he might have left behind. I tapped walls, checked for false backs in the sparse cabinetry, searched for any sign of a personal life. I found nothing, until in the living quarters my foot caught on a floorboard near the bunk. It was loose, my heart hammered in my chest. Using the tip of my knife, I pried it up, and there in the dark, dusty space beneath was a small leather-bound book. It was another logbook, but this one was different. It was smaller, the leather worn smooth with use. It wasn't official. It was his real diary. I opened it with a sense of both triumph and profound dread. The first few years of entries were much like the official log, weather, maintenance. But as the years went on, the tone began to shift. The entries became longer, more philosophical, and then more paranoid. He started referring to the light not as it, but as she. He wrote of her moods, her thirst. One entry from 20 years before his death chilled me to the bone. She spoke to me today, not in words, in the hum of the lens. She is lonely, and she is hungry. The island was quiet for 3 days. I spent that time devouring Silas's diary, my own duties feeling like a pointless distraction. His writing became a spiral into obsession. He described the light as a living entity, a demanding goddess of glass and fire that required not just oil but attention, devotion. He wrote about bringing her gifts, polished stones from the shore, the feathers of seabirds. It was the writing of a man whose mind had been eroded by solitude. It was a comfort in a strange way. It meant I wasn't the one going mad. He was. This was all just the echo of his insanity. Then the third bottle arrived. It was waiting on my doorstep when I opened the tower door at dawn. Placed there, I knew before I even opened it that this one would be worse. The message was short, the spidery handwriting tighter, angrier. I see the way you look at her picture. Let her go. The sea is a jealous mistress. I dropped the note as if it had burned me. My blood turned to ice. Tucked away in the bottom of my sea chest beneath my clothes was a single photograph of my late wife, Eleanor. I only took it out at night, when the loneliness was at its worst. It was my most private ritual, my most secret pain. There was no window into my room from the outside, no place to spy from. The entity, Silas, his ghost, whatever it was, didn't need to see. It knew. It knew the contents of my heart. It knew my grief, and it was using it against me. The feeling of being watched was replaced by a far more terrifying feeling, the feeling of being known. A squall blew in from the north, a furious, churning beast of wind and rain. For 48 hours, the world beyond the lighthouse ceased to exist. There was only the roar of the storm and the groan of the tower as it resisted the assault. I was trapped, a prisoner in my own sanctuary. The wind howled with a new, menacing intelligence. It wasn't just a mindless force of nature. It felt personal. It screamed around the iron gallery, rattling the door, testing the glass. And in the shrieking of the gale, I began to hear things. Whispers, twisted and distorted, as if the wind itself was trying to form words. Thumas. It was my name, stretched and pulled like taffy, a sound that was both there and not there. I told myself it was auditory pareidolia, my brain creating patterns in the chaos. But then came the tapping, a sharp, rhythmic tap, 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 against the glass of the lantern room. I was 150 feet in the air. Nothing could be up there. No bird could fly in this gale. Yet the tapping continued, methodical and patient, moving from one pane of glass to the next, circling the room. It was the sound of a fingernail on a window pane, a deliberate, inquisitive sound. Let me in. I huddled on the floor, my hands over my ears, squeezed my eyes shut and prayed for the dawn, praying that the storm would break before my mind did. The storm passed as quickly as it came, leaving behind a bruised-looking sky and a sea that seethed with exhaustion. I felt the same. Shaken and sleep-deprived, I stumbled outside to inspect for damage. That's when I saw the fourth bottle, bobbing gently in a newly formed tide pool right at the base of the tower. It was as if the storm had delivered it personally. I took it inside, my hands slick with sweat. This time the scroll contained not a message, but a drawing. It was a crude but undeniably accurate floor plan of the lighthouse's ground floor living quarters. It showed the bunk, the stove, the table, and in the corner, a small X was drawn over the exact spot where I had found Silas's hidden diary. My breath hitched in my throat. It was impossible. It was a confirmation of my worst fears. Below the map, a short sentence was scrawled in the same spidery hand. He sees you when you read his words. A profound, horrifying realization washed over me. The messages weren't from Silas. Silas wasn't a lonely castaway or a prankster. He was the subject. The notes were warnings. Something else was on this island. Something that had watched Silas descend into madness. Something that had recorded his secrets, and something that was now watching me repeat the same pattern. The entity wasn't Silas's ghost. It was the thing that had made him a ghost. The being that Silas had called she, the light itself. And Silas, he was still here too. I wasn't alone with one ghost. I was trapped between two. My first instinct was to call for help. The supply boat wasn't due for another 3 months, but there was a shortwave radio in the communications room, a relic from Silas's time for emergencies. I hadn't touched it since my arrival. I burst into the small, dusty room and flicked the power switch. The tubes glowed with a faint orange light. A wave of relief washed over me. It worked. I grabbed the microphone, my voice hoarse as I called out the emergency frequency. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is St. Jude's Needle Lighthouse. Is anyone receiving me? Over. All I got back was static, a thick roaring hiss. I twisted the tuning dial, trying to find a clear channel, but the static was everywhere. And then, the character of the static began to change. It wasn't random anymore. It began to pulse with a slow, rhythmic beat, a deep whump, whump, whump that matched the rotation of the lighthouse beam above me. And woven within the pulsing static was another sound, a high-pitched, warbling tone that sounded chillingly like a distorted human voice, moaning in pain. I remembered a passage from Silas's diary. She will not let me speak to them. She fills the airwaves with her own song. She wants me all to herself. It wasn't a malfunction. The light, the entity, was actively jamming the signal. It was isolating me, cutting me off from the world, just as it had done to him. The radio sparked violently and went dead. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was the silence of a sealed coffin. The fifth bottle arrived the next day. I didn't even want to open it, but I knew I had to. I knew I needed to understand the rules of the game I was trapped in. I sat at my table, the bottle before me like some unholy sacrament. The message inside was not a warning. It was a command, a test. The gulls make too much noise. Their cries displease her. Silence them. I stared at the words, a knot of revulsion tightening in my stomach. The gulls were my only companions. Their raucous, argumentative calls were a reminder that life existed here beyond me and the whispering dread in the tower. They were loud and messy and alive, everything this place was trying to crush. "No," I said aloud, the words sounding small and defiant in the quiet room. "I won't." I burned the note and spent the rest of the day defiantly throwing scraps of my rations to the birds. A small act of rebellion. I felt a sliver of control, but control is an illusion on St. Jude's needle. The next morning, I opened the main door to a scene of grotesque ritualistic horror. Arranged in a perfect 20-foot circle around the base of the tower were the bodies of at least a dozen seagulls. Their necks were broken, but there were no other signs of injury. No predator had done this. It was a neat, deliberate, silent massacre. It was a message far clearer than any note in a bottle. My defiance was meaningless. The entity on this island had power. It had reach, and it was deeply, profoundly displeased. The death of the gulls broke something in me. The feeling of being watched intensified, evolving into a constant prickling paranoia. I never turned my back on the ocean. I sealed the lower windows of the lighthouse with boards. I started seeing things at the edge of my vision. A flicker of movement on the rocks when there was nothing there. A shadow in a corner that was too dark, too defined. And then, I saw him. It was dusk. I was cleaning the lantern room glass, my back to the center of the room. I caught a flicker of movement in the reflection on the pane I was polishing. I froze. Standing in the middle of the room, just behind me, was a man. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in a heavy, dark keeper's oilskin uniform that seemed to be perpetually dripping with seawater, even though the room was dry. His face was a mask of sorrow, his eyes hollowed out, his skin pale and translucent. It was the face from the photograph in the registry. It was Silas. I spun around, my heart seizing in my chest, and there was nothing, just the empty room and the rhythmic hum of the turning lamp. It happened again and again over the next few days. A glimpse of him in a mirror, a fleeting shadow that matched his shape. He never did anything. He just watched, a silent, mournful sentinel. He wasn't the one tormenting me. I realized he was a fellow prisoner, a warning, the salt-stained ghost of a man who had lost the same war I was now fighting. I stopped sleeping in the bunk. The living quarters were too open, too exposed. I began to barricade myself in the small storeroom at the base of the tower each night, jamming a chair under the handle of the heavy iron door. I thought the solid walls would offer some protection. I was wrong. The haunting simply followed me. It was on the third night in my makeshift cell that I heard them. Footsteps. The slow, heavy tread of waterlogged boots on the winding iron staircase that corkscrewed through the center of the tower. Clang, clang, clang. Each step was deliberate, measured, echoing through the stone structure. They were coming up from the base of the tower, a place I knew to be empty. They ascended past my level, continuing their slow climb towards the lantern room. For a terrifying hour, I listened to them pace back and forth directly above my head, the sound muffled but unmistakable. Then, the descent began. Clang, clang, clang. Slower this time. They came down the stairs, and I held my breath as they reached my landing. The footsteps stopped directly outside my barricaded door. The silence that followed was absolute, filled with a suffocating sense of anticipation. I could feel a presence on the other side of that iron door, a cold intelligence waiting patiently. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps resumed, descending into the darkness below and fading away. It was a nightly ritual. Silas, the ghost, was making his rounds, tending his light, checking on the new prisoner. For 2 weeks, the island was quiet except for Silas's nightly patrol. No new bottles washed ashore. I began to hope foolishly that the entity had grown bored of me. I fell into a grim routine, performing my duties by day and hiding in my storeroom by night, a prisoner marking time. The hope shattered on a perfectly calm, clear morning. I unbarred the main tower door to get some fresh air, and my heart stopped. Sitting perfectly in the center of the welcome mat was a new bottle. This one was different from the others. It wasn't covered in barnacles or sea grime. It was clean and dry. It hadn't washed ashore. It had been placed there, a delivery, My hands shook so badly I could barely pick it up. The note inside was a single horrifying sentence, the spidery script now looking less like handwriting and more like something scratched onto the page. "I'm tired of writing. Let me in." The request was so direct, so intimate, it felt like a physical violation. It was no longer a game of observation and cryptic warnings. The entity was no longer content to watch from a distance. It was at my door. It wanted an invitation. It wanted inside my sanctuary, inside my mind. I looked at the heavy iron door, at the thick stone walls of the tower, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my soul, that they would not be enough to keep it out if it truly wanted to enter. The locks were for show. The real battle was for my will. In a desperate search for answers, for some kind of weapon against this thing, I turned back to Silas's secret diary. I read past the initial paranoia and into the final, frantic entries written in the weeks before he drowned. The handwriting becomes a chaotic scrawl, the words tumbling over each other. He was no longer just observing the entity in the light. He was communicating with it. He wrote that it had offered him a bargain. "She promises peace," he wrote, "a quiet harbor for a weary soul. All she asks for in return is tribute. She is tired of the oil and the wind. She wants something real, something warm." The next entries detailed what he gave her. He describes a ritual where he would stand in the beam of the light and consciously feed it his memories. He started with small things, the taste of his mother's bread, the feeling of sunshine on his face. But the light's appetite grew. He gave it the memory of his first love, the sound of his father's laughter, the birth of his child. He was sacrificing his own humanity, bit by bit, to appease it. The final entry was written on the day he vanished. "I have nothing left to give her but my grief, my one last secret sorrow. Tonight I give her everything, and then I will be free," she promised. He hadn't fallen from the rocks. He had walked into the sea. He hadn't been running from the light. He had been running towards what he thought was a reward, a final peace. But the light and the sea had lied. That night, I understood the true horror of Silas's fate. I stood on the rocks below the tower, watching the great beam of light sweep across the turbulent water. It had always been a comforting sight, a symbol of safety and guidance. Now it was a predator's eye. As the beam swung towards me, I saw something coalesce within the light itself. It wasn't a reflection or a trick of the mist. It was a face, Silas's face. But it wasn't the mournful, passive ghost I had seen in the tower. This face was contorted in a silent, eternal scream. Its eyes were wide with a terror that transcended death, its mouth open in a soundless howl of agony. It was salt-stained and waterlogged, trapped within the photons, forever a part of the machine he had tried to bargain with. He wasn't free. He hadn't found peace. He was the fuel. His soul, his agony, his very consciousness had become the new wick for the lamp. The light had taken everything from him, and then it had taken him too. As the beam swept past, his screaming face was projected onto the churning waves, onto the black rocks, then out into the empty darkness of the sea, before swinging back around to begin its horrifying cycle anew. He was the light keeper, and he was the light, forever. I finally knew what was at stake. It wasn't just my life, it was my soul. There was only one option left. I couldn't fight the entity, but I could blind it. I could kill the light. If the lamp went out, the spell would be broken. The supply boat would have to be sent. I would be rescued. I waited for daylight. When the lamp was dormant, I found a heavy sledgehammer in the tool store, its weight a comforting reality in my hands. I climbed to the machine room, my heart pounding with a rebellious fury. The clockwork mechanism was a beautiful, intricate web of brass gears and polished steel levers. It was the heart of the lighthouse, and I was going to stop it. I raised the hammer high over my head, taking aim at the main gear. I put all my strength, all my fear, all my rage into the swing. The hammer descended, and then it stopped. Inches from the brass gear, it stopped dead in midair, as if it had hit an invisible wall. I was thrown backwards by the shocking transference of force, landing hard on the floor. The hammer clattered from my nerveless fingers. I hadn't hit anything, but my arms screamed in protest, my muscles spasming. A whisper echoed through the room, coming not from a single point, but from the very air around me. It was Silas's voice, filled with a deep resonant sorrow and an unyielding authority. The light must be tended. I couldn't stop it. I was part of the system now. The keeper and the lighthouse and its first prisoner would not allow me to neglect my duties. My failed rebellion seemed to awaken a new, more cruel intelligence in the entity. The hauntings became more personal, more surgical in their cruelty. It knew my grief for my wife Eleanor was my deepest vulnerability, the source of the pain that had driven me to this island. And now it began to use that grief as a weapon. One morning I climbed to the lantern room to clean the glass. As the sun rose, it illuminated the interior panes, and on one of them I saw writing. It wasn't ink. It wasn't scratched. The words were traced in a fine crystalline layer of salt rime, as if a damp, invisible finger had written them there during the night. The message was 3 words: "She misses you." The blow was so personal, so vicious that it almost brought me to my knees. It was a lie, of course, a twisted manipulation, but the insidious horror of it was that it was also what my broken heart desperately wanted to believe, that somewhere, somehow, she was still aware of me. The entity was offering me a poisoned hope. It was dangling the thing I wanted most in the world in front of me, trying to lure me into the same kind of bargain Silas had made. It was promising a connection to the dead, a reunion in the light. It was no longer just trying to scare me. It was trying to seduce me. It was showing me that it could give me what I wanted for a price. The price I knew was everything. The psychological assault continued. The entity began leaving me gifts, tributes, as Silas had called them in his diary. They were always placed in impossible locations, waiting for me to find them. One day, it was a perfectly preserved nautilus shell, sitting on top of the fuel tank. The next, a string of kelp, woven into a complex knot, hanging from my doorknob. Each one was a silent testament to its power, its presence. But the third gift broke through my defenses. I went out onto the gallery for some air, and there, sitting perfectly balanced on the thin iron railing, was a small bird, carved from a piece of pale driftwood. It was a sandpiper, its form captured with an artist's skill. My breath caught in my throat. Years ago, for our first anniversary, I had carved a sandpiper exactly like this for Eleanor. It was a clumsy, amateurish thing, but she had treasured it. After she was gone, I had placed it in her coffin, a final token of a love that felt as endless as the sea. No one knew about that carving. It was a memory shared only by me and the dead. And now, here it was again, a perfect copy, delivered to the most isolated place on earth. I didn't touch it. I couldn't. I just stared at it, the wind whipping around me, as the full, soul-crushing reality sank in. The entity wasn't just watching me. It wasn't just guessing my fears. It was inside my head. It was reading the pages of my memory, turning my most sacred moments into instruments of terror. The final storm arrived without warning. It was not a squall. It was an apocalypse. The sky turned the color of a bruise, and the sea rose up in a black, mountainous rage. The tower, which had always felt as solid as the rock it was built on, now shuddered with every wave that crashed against its base. The wind didn't howl, it shrieked, a symphony of tortured souls. I knew, with a primal certainty, that this was it, the endgame. The island was cut off from the universe, a stage set for a final confrontation. The barriers between my world and its were dissolving in the chaos. The whispers were no longer just on the wind. They were inside the room with me. The fleeting glimpses of Silas were gone. Now he walked freely. I saw him standing in the corner, his oilskins dripping water onto the floorboards that did not pool, his hollow eyes fixed on me. He wasn't mournful anymore. His expression was one of grim, sorrowful purpose. The storm was its weapon, and Silas was its herald. The entity was done playing games. It was done leaving gifts. The time for seduction was over. Tonight it would simply take what it wanted. He cornered me in the machine room, the heart of the tower. His form was more solid now, though he still shimmered at the edges like a heat haze. The smell of cold brine and decay filled the air, and for the first time he spoke to me, his voice a low gurgling rasp like a drowning man trying to speak through a throat full of seawater. "You must understand," he gurgled, each word an effort. "She is eternal, and she is lonely. She requires a keeper, a soul to be the flame, a consciousness to witness the endless sea." He raised a trembling, translucent hand and pointed at me. "I have served for 50 years. Myself is almost gone. I am frayed, fading. She needs a new anchor, a new light." His hollow eyes bore into mine, and I saw not malice but a profound, bottomless weariness. He was a prisoner begging for his replacement. "I chose you, Thomas," he whispered, the sound now coming from right beside my ear. "I saw your grief. I knew you were empty. An empty vessel is easiest to fill. Do not fight. It is a kinder fate than the one you ran from. Here your pain will have a purpose. You will become part of something vast. You will burn." He wasn't threatening me. He was offering me a promotion from prisoner to warden, a position he knew was also a death sentence. With a deafening crack of thunder, the generator sputtered and died. The electric lights went out, plunging the tower into a near-total darkness, illuminated only by the rhythmic flash of the great lamp above, which now ran on the old clockwork alone. Its slow, steady turning was a countdown. If it stopped, the light would stop. The entity would be blinded. But Silas wouldn't allow it. His ghost glided towards the massive winding crank. "It must be tended," he rasped. I threw myself in his way. "No more," I yelled, my voice thin against the storm. And we fought. It was the most absurd, terrifying battle of my life, my solid, desperate hands against his cold, ethereal ones. When I pushed against him, it was like pushing through icy water. He was not strong, but he was heavy, impossibly dense, his form imbued with the pressure of the deep ocean. We wrestled for control of the crank, the fate of the lighthouse, the fate of my soul hanging on this one mad struggle. He was trying to force my hands onto the crank, to make me perform the ritual, to accept my role as keeper. "It is your duty," he shrieked, his voice rising with the wind. "There is no escape. The sea has you. The light has you. I have you." He was right. I was tiring. His cold was seeping into my bones. I was losing. It was then that the impossible happened. A sound unlike any other. Not thunder, not wind, but the sharp, explosive crack of breaking glass. I looked up. A hole had appeared in one of the thick, reinforced panes of the lantern room window. A green bottle, the same kind as the very first one I had found, lay shattered on the floor. It couldn't have been the wind. The glass was an inch thick, designed to withstand hurricanes. It was as if something had thrown it with deliberate supernatural force. From the shattered neck of the bottle, a single small scroll of paper had flown free, landing on the floor near my feet. It was a final message. Silas saw it too. He paused his assault, his ghostly form turning to look at the note. He seemed afraid of it. With the last of my strength, I lunged for it and unrolled it. The paper was dry. The handwriting was not the spidery scrawl of the entity. It was a neat, elegant, feminine script I recognized instantly. It was Eleanor's handwriting. The message was a single word, a final gift from a memory the entity could not corrupt, a final command from the love that had defined my life. Run. It was not a plea. It was an order, a release. It was permission. My grief wasn't a weakness. It was my last and only weapon. The word on that paper broke the spell. It was the key. Silas and the light had feasted on his grief, his memories. They had tried to use mine to trap me, but what if I didn't let them? What if I chose to give it to them, not as a tribute but as a sacrifice? A fire sale. I couldn't destroy the light, but maybe I could overfeed it. I could give it a ghost so powerful it would choke on it. I scrambled from the machine room, leaving Silas momentarily confused. I ran to my quarters and dragged out my heavy sea chest, my one link to my past. I threw open the lid. Inside was everything I had been trying to escape. Bundles of letters tied with ribbon, a photo album filled with fading pictures of a life that was no longer mine, her favorite book of poetry, a lock of her hair. Each object was a landmine of memory, a universe of pain. For a year I had been terrified to even look at them. Now, I saw them for what they were: ammunition. The ghost of Silas had followed me, his form flickering with uncertainty. "What are you doing?" he gurgled. "That is not for her. That is yours." "Not anymore," I said, my voice clear and steady for the first time in months. I was no longer the prisoner. I was the master of ceremonies for one final desperate ritual. The maintenance stove was connected to the lamp's heating system, a way to keep the oil from thickening in the winter. It was the lighthouse's gut. I threw the grate open, the flames inside roaring in tune with the storm outside. I picked up the first photograph. It was of Eleanor and me, on our wedding day. Her smile was so bright it could have powered this lighthouse on its own. I held it for a moment, letting the memory wash over me. The joy, the hope, the devastating pain of its loss. I let myself feel it all, one last time, and then I said goodbye. I fed the photograph to the flames. The effect was immediate. The flame in the stove erupted, roaring up the flue with a sound like a jet engine. The light in the great lamp above us flared, pulsing with a brilliant white intensity. It was working. The entity was feasting on the raw, powerful emotion locked in that image. I grabbed a bundle of letters, her letters to me from when I was away, and threw them in. Another surge of power. The light grew brighter still, so bright it hurt to look at. I was giving the light what it wanted, but I was giving it too much, too fast. I was force-feeding the ghost, turning its own hunger into a weapon against it. This wasn't a tribute, it was a poisoning. Silas shrieked, a sound of pure terror and envy. He saw what I was doing. I was giving the light the very thing he had lost, the potent memories of love and loss that it craved above all else. He was being replaced, not by a new keeper, but by a more powerful ghost. My grief was stronger than his. As I continued to feed the fire, the photo albums, the dried flowers, the poetry book, the light in the lantern room became a miniature sun. It was no longer just a beam, it was an explosion of pure white energy that filled the entire tower. The humming of the lens became a deafening roar. Silas's ghostly form couldn't withstand the output. The raw power of the memories I was burning was literally tearing him apart. His salt-stained form began to fray at the edges, dissolving into wisps of mist. He was screaming, but his voice was lost in the roar of the light. He reached out a hand towards me, an expression of utter betrayal on his face, before he was completely consumed, his essence drawn up into the lens and burned away in a final brilliant flash. He was gone, erased, and I was alone with the ravenous, ecstatic god in the machine. I fed the fire until there was nothing left. The sea chest was empty. My past was ash. As the last letter turned to smoke, the light above pulsed one last time, a wave of energy that shook the tower to its foundations. And then it dimmed, returning to its normal, steady glow. The roar subsided to a hum. The storm outside broke, the wind dying with a final mournful sigh. Sunlight, for the first time in days, streamed through the shattered window of the lantern room. It was over. The entity was sated, gorged on the richness of a life's worth of love and sorrow. The presence was gone. The cold was gone. The tower was just a tower again, a shell of stone and glass. I sat on the floor, surrounded by the wreckage, the empty chest beside me like a coffin. I had survived, but the cost was absolute. I had come to this island to escape my grief. I had succeeded. I had burned it out of me. But in doing so, I had also burned away the love that created it. I felt nothing, no pain, no joy, no memory of Eleanor's face. I was a blank slate, an empty room, a hollow man. I was finally, truly, alone. Weeks passed. I don't remember them. I performed my duties like an automaton. I tended the light, but I felt no connection to it. I ate, but tasted no food. I slept, but had no dreams. The silence I had once craved was now my entire existence. When the supply boat finally appeared on the horizon, I felt no relief. It was simply the next event in a sequence. The captain, a cheerful man named Alistair, took one look at me, and his smile vanished. "Good God, man," he said, his voice hushed. "What happened to you?" I didn't answer. I had no words left. My hair had turned bone white. My face was a roadmap of lines that hadn't been there 3 months ago. My eyes, he later told the company, were like 2 burned-out holes in a blanket. I walked past him onto the deck of the boat without a word, without a single look back at the lighthouse. I left everything behind: the empty sea chest, the official logbook, my post. As the boat pulled away from St. Jude's Needle, Alistair tried to speak to me again. He asked about the broken window, about my health. I just stared at the white tower shrinking in the distance. I had survived my haunting, but I had a horrifying thought. What happens to a god when its meal is finished? What happens when it gets hungry again? His name is Michael. He is young, full of a romantic notion of a life away from the noise of the world. He finds the solitude invigorating. The lighthouse to him is a magnificent, beautiful machine. He performs his duties with a cheerful diligence, documenting his life in his own new journal. He reads the official logbook I left behind, noting my neat final entry: generator failed, awaiting relief. A simple professional lie. He thinks of me as just another keeper in a long line. One sunny afternoon, while walking the shore at low tide, Michael sees a glint of green in a tide pool. It is a thick old glass bottle, a relic from another time. His heart gives a hopeful lurch, a message from the world, a piece of random wonderful magic. He smiles as he works the stubborn tar-sealed cork free. He unrolls the small damp piece of paper. The handwriting is not spidery or old. It is neat, precise, and achingly familiar to me. It is my handwriting. He reads the 5 simple words I wrote in my own journal, the night before the supply boat came to rescue my body, but not my soul. A warning I was compelled to leave, a part of the duty I could not escape. The message reads: "The new wick burns too bright. The cycle is not broken. The light is eternal, and the light must be tended." And so the account ends, leaving us with a chilling truth. A curse is rarely broken, merely passed on. The story of the salt-stained man is now entered into the archives. Thank you for attending this meeting of the Midnight Society. If you wish to be present for our next tale from the shadows, subscribe and ring the bell. Until then, stay safe and listen to the silence.